Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 5 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Vegas Golden Knights and won by a score of 4-1. And the Sharks had a very real challenge here in this game. They came in with a pretty inexperienced and very young lineup tonight, going up against a Golden Knights team that pretty much had their NHL roster. Eichel, Hurdle, Carlson, Stone, Hanifin, Theodore, Marner, all in the lineup for this game for Vegas, and unsurprisingly, the Sharks did get outplayed. I don't think you could really argue against that fact. The Golden Knights had the majority of the chances, the majority of the zone time in this particular game, but that doesn't bother me in the preseason whether a team is getting outplayed or is the one doing the outplaying, because of the just varying levels of lineup strength that every single team comes into the preseason with. However, what has been somewhat disappointing to see from the Sharks in the previous 4 preseason games has been the fact that they have been outworked relatively consistently. That is something that you can control even if your lineup is weaker, and it is something that I think the Sharks rectified here in this game, because yes, they were outplayed, but they did a very good job of hanging with the Vegas Golden Knights. The thing that really impressed me the most here, obviously they're hemmed into their own zone a lot, but they did a pretty good job of limiting great chances because they had very active sticks. The Golden Knights were attempting many different times to try and get these cross-ice passes, trying to pull off these maneuvers to get Nedeljkovic going from left to right, and San Jose, whether it be the forward group or the defensive group, seemed to be able to get a stick on a lot of these passes, which limited the opportunities Vegas was really going to be able to pull off. Their one goal that they actually scored here tonight from Alexander Holtz was a very lucky deflection off of a Sharks player, I believe, in front to get past Nedeljkovic. Otherwise, this would have been a shutout opportunity here for San Jose. So a game that definitely is one you really wanted to have in this preseason. Unfortunately, it's not the last game that really gives you that momentum heading into the first game of the regular season, because the Sharks do play again tomorrow for the actual last game of the preseason, but it does set themselves up a lot better. Now, in the first period, the Sharks strike first with a goal from Ethan Cardwell. Great work from Regenda to get him that puck, and then it's just an absolute beautiful shot. You'll be hearing these two names a lot in this review tonight. Second period comes along, and it is Afanasyev who gets the power play goal. Another really nice pass from Regenda, but it really starts with a great keep-in at the blue line from Luca Cagnoni. Then the third period comes around. It is another Ethan Cardwell goal. That makes it 3-0. Then it is the aforementioned Alexander Holtz goal that takes that unlucky deflection, but Cardwell eventually caps it off with the empty netter, completing this preseason hat trick for himself and the 4-1 victory for the Sharks. Moving on to the lineup here tonight, of course, usually I would start with the on-paper first line for the San Jose Sharks, which tonight is Musty, Misa, and Smith, but that just did not seem appropriate for the type of game that we had here tonight. Instead, I will start off with what was the Sharks' third line of the night, where we have a Stapchuk flanked by both Regenda and Cardwell, as these two players in particular, no offense to Stapchuk, but Regenda and Cardwell absolutely stole the show. Stapchuk still played pretty well, but he had significantly less minutes than both of his wingers, because Regenda and Cardwell were just miles better than pretty much every other player on this team. In fact, if you were to take the other 10 forwards and combine them, it would still be probably a lower level of performance than what we got from Regenda and Cardwell. It was just that impressive. Cardwell, as I mentioned, he picks up the hat trick. Regenda picks up 4 assists in this game, if I am not mistaken. It is kind of reminiscent of the game that Daniil Gushchin had in last year's preseason, also against the Vegas Golden Knights, where he picked up 5 assists. But the big difference maker here is that Gushchin was able to take advantage of some of the more empty ice that exists in a preseason game, as teams aren't maybe as committed defensively to be able to pick up all of those point totals. But here with Regenda, many of these are coming from just extreme hard work, the type of projectable assets and skills that actually work out well at the NHL level, even in the regular season, which makes this even more promising. The question now, however, when it comes to both of these players is whether or not they can actually end up making it onto the NHL roster. They certainly have done enough in this preseason to be able to do so. Regenda has played 3 games. 2 of them have been really great. The first one was more so like a pretty good still, but not that bad. And then Cardwell as well has played 3 games, 2 very good ones, including tonight, and another that was more so of that middle of the pack situation. But here's the problem when it comes to this Sharks roster. You can only have 23 players in the NHL. Two of them will be the goaltenders, Nedeljkovic and Askarov, and it does seem as though the Sharks are still heading into the direction of having 8 defensemen. Theoretically, this could be a solution to the Sharks' problems by instead running with 7 defensemen, but that would mean you would either have to waive one of Desharnais, Leddy, or Liljegren. I don't see them waiving Leddy since they just picked him up a couple of months ago, and Desharnais and Liljegren I think they'll want to keep around, which means that the Sharks will only be able to have 13 forwards here in the NHL, and 10 of them are pretty much set in stone. You have Celebrini, Smith, and Skinner, you have Misa, Toffoli, and Eklund, and you have Wenberg, Kurashev, and Graf. The only two kind of borderline players in this top 9 were Graf and Kurashev. You could sort of argue, but both of these players had solid preseasons and were ahead of the curve enough to be able to definitely get that top 9 spot, or at least be deserving of it. Misa is also kind of the one exception. His preseason has been pretty good, but obviously being that second overall pick does give him the special privilege of still being able to make this Sharks lineup, so you're kind of pulling some strings to get him there. And then the 10th player is your 4th line center, which is going to end up being Adam Gaudette. That leaves you with 3 empty spots and 4 NHL players. Now, Carl Grundstrom, he's gone. I don't think this is even much of a discussion at this point. He's played a few preseason games. He hasn't been anything better than average-ish in those games, so he's definitely been eclipsed by many other players here. If Grundstrom is still on this team in 3 days' time, I would be really, really surprised. The problem is, though, your 3 other slots seem like they might end up being filled by your 3 other NHL players. Now, Ty Dellandrea was originally coming into this training camp another easy, at least in my opinion, waiver selection, someone who could definitely end up getting sent down, but despite his first preseason game being very bad, he picked it up with 2 very impressive outings, or at least one very impressive outing where he was the Sharks' best forward in that particular game a few days ago. Here tonight, he wasn't outstanding, obviously pales in comparison to either Regenda or Cardwell, but was still one of the Sharks' better forwards, I would say. And so if you came in with a clean slate here in this preseason, you could certainly argue that Dellandrea has done enough to earn a lineup spot. Now, I think you can't really forget the 70 games that he played last season, but Warsofsky was actually a fan of those 70 games for whatever reason, so it is possible Dellandrea is still in that NHL conversation at this point. Then you have Ryan Reeves, who again, coming into this preseason, it was kind of believed that he would have this spot no matter what, but in his very small sample size of 1 game that he has played thus far, Ryan Reeves was actually quite good, and so you could say he has also earned that position. The one standout player, however, is then Barclay Goodrow, another guy who coming into this preseason seemed like it would be impossible to knock him out of an NHL lineup spot. He's kind of like that guy in a youth hockey team who basically gets to keep a roster spot because his dad owns the team or coaches the team, and so no matter what happens, he's always there by default. That's exactly the situation that Goodrow kind of finds himself in at this point, because just like Ryan Reeves, he has a very small sample size of just 1 preseason game thus far, but unlike Reeves, who was actually good in his 1 game, Goodrow was the worst forward on the ice in his 1 game, and so he seems like a very obvious candidate to send down. This is a player who probably wouldn't even get picked up off of waivers considering his absolutely terrible contract, and so he is a possibility to be called up at a later point, but it is just so hard for me to imagine that Mike Grier would actually end up doing so. The fact that Barclay Goodrow is even potentially in a conversation for being captain of this team, the fact that the Sharks would only give him 1 preseason game, which is almost like a vote of confidence from Warsofsky, oh, we already know what you're capable of, so we only really need to give you this 1 game to warm up, that makes me believe that they're not in any sort of conversations to get rid of this particular player, and so both Regenda and Cardwell sit on the outside looking in, despite the fact that they have heavily outperformed multiple players on this roster. Now, if the Sharks can find one position, and if they are willing to send down Goodrow, which I do think should happen, the player who likely does end up getting priority is Regenda. Not only has he maybe had a slightly, ever so small, better performance than Cardwell, but an important distinction exists, which is that Regenda is waiver exempt and Cardwell is not. And so the general messaging for Cardwell from the coaching staff, from Mike Grier, could be something like, you've done well enough, you definitely deserve a lineup spot, but it's just not quite the right time just yet. So send him down, have him play big minutes there, and then get him on an actual NHL position by next season. But Regenda, you can't really do this. I wouldn't be surprised if the Vegas scouts, of course, were watching this game, but other scouts as well, seeing what potential waiver wire pickups that they are going to have by the last day, the waiver deadline in the NHL, which is Sunday, since full-on NHL rosters need to be submitted on Monday. I wouldn't be surprised if a team actually puts in a claim for Regenda. As I said, very projectable skills that he has shown off in each of these preseason games that he has played for the San Jose Sharks. He is a big player, 6'4". He is someone who can play on a fourth line and clearly have the success to be able to do so. So he would be an interesting player. Plus, he's not even all that old. He's 25 years old, definitely fits into the age window for pretty much any team to be able to make a move there. So for San Jose, Regenda seems like someone that they should want to have stick around, but they'll have to make a tough decision that I don't think that they were expecting to have to make when coming into this training camp a couple of weeks ago. Now, when it comes to actually the rest of this team, we have the actual top line on paper, Musty, Misa, and Smith. This was a trio of players that it was very exciting to see them placed together for this game. It was something that it looked like it was going to be a ton of fun, and it would have if this were like a rookie face-off game or perhaps like one of those first couple games of the preseason when you go up against an AHL lineup, but against a Vegas Golden Knights team that is extremely skilled, extremely talented, extremely experienced. Suddenly, it doesn't really look as promising. Then you kind of see the flaws of putting these three players together, where Will Smith is the most NHL-ready guy on this line, despite the fact that he is just 20 years old and has just one season under his belt and is not very good defensively. Then you have Quentin Musty, who's not NHL-ready and is now having to face off against a really, really great team, and Michael Misa here, who is an 18-year-old player who's only playing his, fourth preseason game of his entire career here in the NHL. So this was a really tough matchup for these three players, and it showed on the ice. They just got absolutely caved in. They couldn't get anything generated offensively. Multiple just really tough defensive zone shifts for them as well. Smith, generally, his preseason thus far hasn't necessarily been that great. The kind of saving grace there is that even in the games where he hasn't necessarily played very well for a full 60 minutes, he has made enough offensive plays to get you still excited about what is to come this season. But here tonight, because of just how overwhelmingly outmatched this trio was, that didn't happen, and so Smith just kind of ended up not looking particularly good at all. Quentin Musty showcasing definitely that he's not ready for an NHL spot this season. That's not that much of a surprise. This was still all in all a pretty successful preseason for Quentin Musty, but obviously he'll be heading to start this year with the San Jose Barracuda. Misa was actually the standout, if you want to call him, on this line. Obviously, it's not saying much because both Musty and Smith struggled considerably, but I'd say Misa was the player who had the best game of the three of them. Just from a defensive standpoint, he does continue to show a decent amount. You're still waiting for much offense to actually be created, but like I said, in such a difficult matchup like existed here tonight against Vegas, I actually thought it was all right. When it comes to the Sharks' second line here, we have Graf, Dellandrea, and Lund. This was a very low event line, at least for the first couple of periods. They didn't generate much, but they also didn't give much room for Vegas to do much of anything, which was actually in the end pretty good in a game such as this. But when it got to the third period and Vegas started to get a little bit more dangerous and deadly, they started to have a few more issues. When it comes from an individual standpoint, as I already mentioned with Ty Dellandrea, a decent enough game, honestly, all things considered here for Dellandrea, definitely keeping himself in that conversation, but still a potential waiver wire cut for San Jose in a couple of days' time. Then you have Cam Lund, who will definitely end up getting sent down. It was still an alright showing for Lund. He's still showcasing the fact that he has those 11 NHL games already under his belt. There is a certain amount of knowledge of what it takes to have success in the NHL. He's just not quite there yet. And then there is Colin Graf, who I think defensively did some really solid things here in this game, as he has done throughout the entire preseason. He was also a very key part of the Sharks' penalty kill here tonight, which got a ton of work. The Golden Knights not only had multiple power plays in this game, but they are one of the most dangerous power play units in the entire NHL. And this season they managed to add Mitch Marner to that, just further escalating how easy it is going to be for them to get chances and for them to get goals, and yet the Sharks were able to keep that power play off the board here in this game. Graf was a big part of that. He was also the Sharks' go-to forward in the 5-on-3 situation, which does show a lot of confidence in him as a player. So as I said, someone who will definitely be on that NHL opening lineup. And then finally, we have the Sharks' fourth line, Afanasyev with Bowers and Grundstrom. As I said with Grundstrom, he's definitely gone at this point. I can't really see a world where he is kept around here with the Sharks. This game was nothing special once again, and so that's probably his time done. Shane Bowers, I thought, looked okay at times here, maybe like a couple of shifts that were actually pretty good. He was someone who was actually called up for this set of back-to-back games just so the Sharks, had a warm body to fill into a lineup spot. He's definitely more of a Barracuda guy. And then when it comes to Afanasyev, there were some good things here tonight, but when you have Regenda and Cardwell, who you are competing with for one of those potential final spots on an NHL lineup, you're just heavily overshadowed. So it's not as though Afanasyev was bad, it just wasn't good enough to keep up with those two players. On the defensive side of things, we have the Sharks' top pairing of Mukhamadullin and Liljegren, and I'll actually start with Liljegren, a player I have been rather critical of throughout this entire preseason thus far. It's not as though that he has been terrible, but it just feels as though he hasn't done enough to really get himself into the conversation for a top 6 defensive spot here, and just looked more like a 7th defenseman for San Jose. But here tonight, I actually thought this was one of, if not the most impressive performance from Liljegren thus far in this preseason, and it's not because he was doing so much offensively, which is usually where you would find Liljegren doing well. You think back to his best games on the Sharks last season, both came against basically the Toronto Maple Leafs, his former team. It was the offense that was really exciting to see from Liljegren, but there wasn't a ton of opportunities to create in this game. Defensively, however, I thought Liljegren was really, really solid. I mentioned the active sticks that the Sharks had in this game. Liljegren was a huge part of that, constantly being able to cover for those backdoor plays, preventing those cross-crease passes. Liljegren just seemed very, very dialed in. He knew that his starting spot on the NHL roster was up for grabs here, was on the line, and he definitely showed up. So really good outing for Timothy Liljegren, and the same can definitely be said for Mukhamadullin as well. His position in the lineup wasn't up for grabs. We already know he's going to be a top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. There are conversations that he might even be the best defenseman for the Sharks currently. That was my bold prediction, actually, that by the end of this season he would be. We'll see what ends up happening there. But he, I think, had a very good night for himself as well. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing here, we have Dickinson and Desharnais. Dickinson, again, just a really solid night. There was slightly more attempts at offensive creation in this game compared to the last one, but still pretty muted. But as I've already mentioned, with the context of the type of team that they were against here and the type of talent that they were against here, it's not a surprise that Dickinson's not going to have so many openings there. Defensively, though, I think he did a lot of very, very good things. The one issue that still remains, and I've mentioned this multiple times already, and I'll say it again here, is Dickinson continuously attempting to challenge players in these one-on-one situations, which does sometimes put him a little bit out of position. We saw the Golden Knights actually a few times here in this game be able to get behind the Sharks' defense, and this did happen once or twice for Dickinson in this game, so that is something to correct, but otherwise he has been remarkably sound throughout this preseason thus far. And when it comes to Desharnais, he's had a very up and down preseason. He started off very well, then had a pretty bad second game, a slightly better but still not great third game, and here tonight again, I would say Desharnais actually continued to trend upwards. It was an alright outing for him, perhaps not enough to really get that guaranteed starting top 6 spot, but as I mentioned earlier on, I think the Sharks will run with 8 defense, and Desharnais will be a part of that, but if the Sharks are refusing to actually having to make some tough choices and they actually do decide to go with 14 forward setup so that they can keep Regenda around, maybe Desharnais is on the chopping block. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing here, we have Cagnoni and Thompson. Now, it was a rough start for Cagnoni. His first 2 shifts of the game were not good at all. He made a couple of really, really bad defensive reads that led to some great chances for Vegas, and then he kind of had to work from that deficit throughout the entire game. But really, past those first couple shifts, he improved significantly. I thought he did a lot of really great things, had some fantastic moments. As I I mentioned, that keep in on the Afanasyev goal at the on the blue line on the power play showcased his ability to be such a clutch player in that power play type of situation. And so Cagnoni, offensively, I think, it wasn't obviously like super active because, again, the situation that the Sharks were in against a really, really good team here, but had some flashy moments. And then defensively, while those reads were rough, that is definitely something to work on. What I was very impressed with Cagnoni is, again, as I mentioned with Liljegren, that active stick. And this is very important for Cagnoni. As that undersized defenseman, it's not going to be a frequent thing for him to be able to go into corners with guys who are like 6'2", 6'3", and to outmuscle them and win a puck battle. Instead, if Cagnoni is going to be able to find consistent success defensively at the NHL level, it really does have to come down to having an active stick and to be able to break up plays in that way. It's something that you see out of guys like Cale Makar. It's something that you see out of Lane Hudson or out of Quinn Hughes, some of the best but somewhat undersized defensemen in the NHL. Cagnoni is going to have to get to this level. I think this was very much recognized from him throughout this offseason. It was one of the things that was highlighted that he did have to work on, and we can see what type of progress he has made, managing to break off multiple plays here. You can recall, not in this game, but a previous one where like a 2-on-1 situation happens and he's able to just immediately intercept that and get the puck going the other way. So there's a lot of impressiveness with what Cagnoni has shown. It was a rough start, but a great finish. And then when it comes to Jack Thompson, kind of a quiet game for Thompson. Now, it should be noted that when these two players are on the ice, I am a little bit more focused on what Cagnoni is doing because I just find him to be more of an intriguing prospect. But I imagine if Thompson had done some great things, it still would have stood out, and that just didn't quite happen. So I've already mentioned that Thompson is on the outside looking in as that ninth defenseman, and the Sharks are obviously not going to run with 9 defensemen in the NHL, so he would probably have to go on waivers, and I don't think any performances thus far in the preseason has really changed that plan. Now, at this point, he might not get picked up, honestly. These performances haven't been all that great, and while taking a flyer on a young right-handed defenseman could be very tempting for a different NHL team, that does mean that he has to remain in the NHL, and maybe the teams aren't ready to do that, so it's possible we'll still see him with the San Jose Barracuda. Perhaps we'll see what happens. And then finally, we have the goaltender here tonight. It is Nedeljkovic. This is his second start in the preseason. The first one was against Vegas as well. He picked up the shutout, and here tonight he lets in just the one goal, but I mentioned earlier on a lucky bounce. This could have technically been a shutout otherwise for Nedeljkovic, and this begs a very interesting question of who actually gets the first start of the season for the Sharks in a few days' time. It will be against Vegas, so a team that Nedeljkovic has had success against in this preseason. And while Askarov has not been bad thus far, he has led in a few goals, and Nedeljkovic has not. And so while one would have originally thought that since Askarov is like the future of goaltending on this team, the young guy, and it's your home opener, and you want to get him into the lineup, that would have been the original plan. It feels as though Nedeljkovic may have played himself into that starter's net for opening night. We'll see what decision the Sharks end up coming to. I imagine Askarov does play tomorrow, and that will be an opportunity to perhaps showcase, if he puts up a shutout, that certainly changes things. But right now, it seems as though Nedeljkovic might be the favorite for that spot. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. Final preseason game of the season. Thankfully for that, as 6 preseason games is definitely tiring to get through. It'll be against the Utah Mammoth. But what is more so important is that game takes place tomorrow on Saturday. The very next day on Sunday is the waiver deadline. That is the final day to be able to put players onto waivers, because on Monday it is the deadline for submitting your NHL roster. I'm pretty sure about all of these facts that I am saying, and so some really tough decisions for the San Jose Sharks coming up. We'll see what they end up doing. Class dismissed.